Welcome everybody to this very nerdy talk. It's a talk I have been wanting to give for ages. This is something very dear to my heart, and I don't usually get to talk about this stuff. But my name is, and let's see if I can progress the slides. For some reason I can't. Yes. My name is Kaat Vander Straeten. I live in Wayland and I wear a lot of t-shirts, as many of you know, in this town. One of which is as a core member of Energize Wayland, which is, of course, the group that brings you this webinar. And Energize Wayland offers residents, organizations, businesses, etc. in town a way to address climate change with actions of all kinds, with all kinds of impacts. So we have vetted a lot of these actions and offer them to you on this platform called energizewayland.org. You can also see all our other events there. And I urge you to go there and maybe register and tell us all the actions you've already done so we can count you towards Wayland's goal. I do a lot of other stuff, and in everything I do, I have an interest in living systems. And so today I'm going to talk about a system that is a necessary condition for all the other living systems on this planet, and that is the living soil. There's a lot of interest in the living soil nowadays, especially with regard to carbon sequestration. And maybe we'll get to that, but I'm not optimistic. I have so much more to say first. But carbon sequestration could be actually a topic of a next talk. So why am I here talking about the soil? I point out that I have a PhD, but I'm not a scientist. Actually, I have the real permanent head damage because my PhD is in metaphysics and it will actually show. But I do have three bodies of knowledge from which I can draw to talk about soil. And it's these three. So I am a certified permaculture designer. Permaculture is yet another topic for a great talk. Let's just say that in permaculture, we try to understand nature as a living system, and we try to understand it, work with it, and actually mimic it in our human systems so that our human systems can be resilient and good systems for the planet and for ourselves. I've really simplified permaculture here, but that's basically it. I also took quite a few courses in Korean natural farming inputs, which I'm sure no one here has ever heard about. They are fantastic inputs that you can use in your gardens, very practically oriented field. And I'd love to talk about that as well. But I use these inputs in my own gardens and I have seen the results of those. But the main source of this coming talk is Elaine Ingham's Life in the Soil course, of which I'm a graduate. If there's any scientist in this country, at least, that is the most outspoken about life in the soil and has been so for over a decade, actually several decades, that is Elaine Ingham. And she has taught me a lot about soils. Let's see how I can advance this slide. So let's jump right in it. I told you, right, it was going to be nerdy. Well, here we are in middle school. So just really quick. In order for plants to grow, and this is your average middle school biology lesson, they need, like every other system, a flow of energy and matter into the system, inside it, through it, and back out. That's just how living systems work. Now, in this middle school picture, plants are called autotrophs, which literally means that they are self-feeding. That's just what that Latin means. This is a very misleading term and already an indication of what is wrong here with this picture, and something we will be correcting. But for now, it means not that they miraculously make their own food out of nothing or out of only themselves, or that they even eat themselves. According to this conventional picture, they seem to need only the simplest elements of matter, these nutrients from their surroundings, and energy from light, from the sunlight, to photosynthesize. So with these very simple things, they then make complex organic compounds, glucose to begin with, and other carbohydrates, also fats and proteins, etc. And of course, These make up what are these delicious plant bodies that we animals then get to eat. And that's why we are called heterotrophs. We feed on others. We need to feed plants or other animals who have fed on those plants. So plants are really the beginning of this chain we are looking at here. So notice how I underlined the words simple and complex. And I'm going to put this in this slide, which we are going to revisit a lot during this talk. It's a more structured form of this explanation, a conventional explanation. So by this conventional story, heterotrophs, after the plants have made these bodies, they then digest this complex stuff and turn it into simple stuff. This too is also not correct, another asterisk right there. And this error here, it's another error, but it's actually another facet of the same error as calling plants autotrophs. And the basic of these errors is that there is something missing in this picture, which is the picture that we all get in middle school, right? We are not looking here at the complete system. You see, plants cannot do this by themselves. Yes, they need matter and energy, but they also need, as an absolute necessary condition, a third one, a third party, and that is this healthy living soil that we'll be talking about tonight. So what is a healthy living soil? What is that? Well, first of all, you have to stop thinking of soil as a solid, or even of yourself as a solid, of course. We are all mixtures of solids, gases, and fluids, and I've actually left out a couple of states of matter. For instance, we humans, of course, are 60% water by weight. Nothing is also even just itself. Everything is always many things. Genetically, for instance, only 10% of our cells are human. 90% are bacterial, and some are actually even fungal. And we'll come back to that. And it's the same for soil. It is not just one thing. And here is a picture of an ideal soil, which means that this soil is not compacted. There are lots of, actually 50% of this are open spaces. When it rains and it gets waterlogged, it's 50% water. When it's dry and all those open spaces are empty, it's 50% air. And ideally, we have a nice combination of those, right? 45% of that soil will be mineral particles, and that comes from the bedrock. It's weathered from the bedrock. It can be all kinds of, all sizes of rocks. And of course, the bedrock is the source of all the elemental nutrients. And then the remaining 5% is organic matter. 20% of that is alive, 10% is roots, and 10% is organisms that are living. And 80% of that is what we call humus. And that is organic matter that was once alive and is now dead, plus all these humates and exudates and acids that we will get back to, which were produced or are produced by the living organisms. And it's actually these exudates and humates that give a healthy soil that nice dark chocolate brown color. When you have that color in your soil, it's already a good indication of life in your soil. So though only 10% of the 5% of organic matter is living organisms, they are actually vital to healthy soil. Without them, this soil would just be dirt. And this is the point. Any plant that you stick into it will have nothing to eat, unless, of course, you bring in a bag of fertilizers from elsewhere. But wait a moment, you might say, if there are rocks and water and air here, and even all this dead plant material, surely the nutrients are there, right? There's plenty to eat here. Well, so let's be clear that most of the soils on the planet have all the elemental nutrients inside them in these minerals that are essentials for plants to grow. We have to be certain about that. And actually a lot of studies show this. There are some exceptions on the planet, but for us, that is definitely the case. So what is essential? Well, we used to think only NPK, there were only 3 essential nutrients, right? Then people said, well, there are 7. Then there were 12. And last time I looked, this slide is 2 years old. there were 17 elemental nutrients that were essential for germination, growth, and survival of plants. And so let's be clear about this again. There's really no need to mine gypsum or any other source of calcium from somewhere else to have it shipped across the globe and then to feed it from a bag to your plants. There is enough calcium already there. But if your soil is lifeless, your crop will still starve. And why is that? That is because the calcium is there, but is not available to your plants. So it needs to be available as well. So remember this slide, the old slide. Well, here's some extra information in red. The plant does need all these simple nutrients, but in many soils, these elements are stuck. They're either stuck in the chemical bonds in organic matter, or they're stuck in these crystalline scaffolding of the minerals. So if you give a plant a chunk of limestone or a dead animal, like maybe a fish, like you do with the three sisters, or a bunch of dead leaves, it can't eat it. That stuff is too complex. And there are only special organisms that can break these complex bonds and pull these nutrients out and then make them available for plants to take up. So this is how Elaine Ingham says it. She says biology determines the available pools of nutrients. Or another way of saying this is that soil chemistry happens through soil biology. No soil biology, no soil chemistry. So which are those organisms that can decompose minerals and organic matter down into elemental forms? They are bacteria and fungi. We call them best friends or BF. I'm just going to be calling them BF. Only they make the enzymes that can pull this off. And how do they do that? It happens through decomposition. And decomposition is a process of comminution and digestion. So take the earthworm. It's a mistake to say that an earthworm digests organic matter or minerals into elements. It does not. It comminutes. It crushes, grinds, shreds, and cuts big chunks into smaller chunks and exposes more of the surfaces. Then the actual digestion is done inside the worm, but not by the worm. Inside its gut, there are bacteria and fungi, BF, and they do the digesting. They break down these exposed surfaces and decompose them into simple elements. It's of course the same for us. Remember, 90% of all our cells are bacterial, and actually there is a significant fungal component to that as well, but that science is still in its infancy. So we chew, and our teeth and the enzymes in our saliva comminute our food. But it's really the BF inside our digestive tract that do the actual digesting. They extract the simple nutrients that then our genetically human cells can take up to grow and be healthy. And it's the same for plants. But where is a plant's digestive system? It's less so inside them. So some of that digestive system is inside them. Some of it is also above ground on its leaf surface, the stem surface. But most of the plant's gut, as it were, is in the soil around its roots, called the rhizosphere. Okay, so back to this slide. Remember this slide and the error there. We are actually ready to correct this error and make this complete. And I'm going to do that right now. There we go. So the error was that animals, when they digest plants, break down these complex bonds. That is not the case. It's the bacteria and the fungi in their gut that do that. And this makes this system complete, makes the explanation finally complete. Plants need simple matter particles. They make those into complex bonds. The bacteria and fungi break those down into simple particles. They go back to the plant and the whole thing can start all over again and keep going round and round, which is of course what nature does. So this is another thing, and here's where the systems thinking and the metaphysics comes up, is that the fact that we're actually looking at a circular explanation, a circular image here, is an indication that we're much closer to the fact of the matter. So this is an ingenious system. It's very well balanced and calibrated, and of course it's the product of billion years of evolution. In a healthy soil, the soil life feeds the plant. It feeds the right stuff in proper form. It feeds it at the right time and in the right amount and at the plant's request. The plant knows what it needs in whichever season, whatever time of day, whatever happened to it. It got crushed and now it needs to replenish something. And the plant will request the right nutrients. So the plant is in control. So what does that even mean, that the plant requests the nutrients? How does that even work? So plants put stuff out called exudates. It's kind of like a juices. And most of these exudates, actually all of these exudates, are comprised of mostly sugars, some proteins, and some carbohydrates. And think about it, when you mix this up in your kitchen, what do you get? Cakes and cookies. And Ingham waxes poetical when she talks about cakes and cookies. She must love those very much. And this is actually also what bacteria and fungi love to eat. Plants can actually give away up to 45% of the energy that they make from photosynthesis into exudates. They don't use this for themselves, for their own growth. They give almost half of that energy away for the growth of these organisms in the soil around, in their rhizosphere. Except for weeds. So if you were ever looking for a good definition, like a proper definition of a weed, here it is. Weeds only put 20% of energy into growing roots, and only half of that into exudates, only 10%. That's why they are the earliest succession species, which means they are the only species of plants that can grow in compacted and dead soil in dirt. They can live on very simple food webs that supply only a few simple nutrients. They have a short life cycle. They go to seed ASAP. That's why they don't put much energy into anything else except into their seeds. But then as they put out a ton of seeds and more weeds grow next year, or even in the same season, we all know how that goes. More of these exudates are put out just because there are more weeds. So more bacteria and fungi come, etc., etc. And that's how things get started, from a dead soil. And that's how succession can grow. So next up here, corn and oats, potatoes, garlic, and then of course shrubs and trees. These are each time the next level of succession. And as you can see, by the time there's a tree growing there, 80% of its photosynthesis energy will go towards the roots, and half of that into exudates. There's a lot to be said about succession, but I'm going to have to skip that. So, all right, so the plant puts out the right exudates to attract the exact species of bacteria or fungi that it needs to solubilize the precise nutrients that it needs in that moment. That's how complex it is. The bacteria and fungi come. They use the energy from the exudates to rip the nutrients off the rock and out of the organic matter. And there we are. So no, that is unfortunately not the end of the story. These bacteria and fungi will not release the nutrients all the nutrients that the plant needs. And I will spare you all the math, but the upshot is that most of the nutrients they keep to themselves. They keep it for themselves. Now, this is really a good thing. It means that these nutrients will not leach away. They stay in place. And actually, soil bacteria and fungi are they're not very mobile. They really glue themselves into the pores, into a soil. So these nutrients will not flow away. They're stuck in these BF, And that's great in comparison to dirt, for instance. If you have dirt or dead soil and you put lots and lots of nitrogen on it, it will just wash away in the next rain. And this is, of course, what we see happening to our ponds and our oceans, these great dead zones of fertilizer in there. So it's great, it won't leach away, but it's also still not available to our plants. It's still tied up. So we're still missing something. So let's go back to this picture of a healthy soil. And let's have another look at this 5% organic matter triangle in detail. So here it is in a different form. 10% is of the organic matter is roots, 80% is humus, and in here is the 10% of the living organisms. And this is a map of the trophic levels. This is really a map of who eats who. If we only had bacteria and fungi, like I said, then most of the nutrients would be tied up in them, right? So we need predators to come in and eat them and release the nutrients in soluble form. And so here you see all these other predators. We need more trophic levels. So how does that work? Well, now it could get super nerdy, and let's just have a quick look for all the the fans out here, but I'll make it really, really quick. And anyone who's interested in this, I can send you a little paper on this as well. But basically, in order to satisfy the optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio in their bodies, soil predators need to eat more nitrogen than they need in order to satisfy their carbon requirement. So for every bacterium that is eaten by a protozoan, that protozoan gets enough carbon, but it gets too much nitrogen. So for instance, a protozoan's ideal ratio is 30:1. Well, if it eats a bacterium, it'll have enough of the nitrogen. If it will have to eat, 6 bacteria to satisfy the requirement of 30 carbon, but it will also have eaten too many nitrogen. And so what does it do? It gets rid of the nitrogen. So it basically poops that out into the soil in the shape of a soluble nitrogen, which then the plant can eat. And so if we go back here, I've added some arrows. That is what this picture is showing. That goes back to the plants. Now, on top of that, all of these predators also need to die and be eaten. And that is really how nutrient cycling happens in the soil. So your soil life needs to be very diverse. You have to have all kinds of species of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, earthworms, spiders, and even moles, etc. If you have a full food web like that, then you have nutrient cycling. And when you destroy the biology of your soil, there is no nutrient cycle. And so finally, we made it. Finally, the plant can eat, and so can we. And I just have a couple of conclusions, and then we can have a conversation about this. So first conclusion is we obviously need a paradigm change on fertilizing. We have to start paying attention to the soil and really understand it, and teach the complete picture, at least of it, in schools. We have to also stop fooling ourselves that plant nutrients are merely a matter of chemistry or NPK. Just look at the majority of our soil tests, right? None of them test for soil. None of them even test for signs of life in the soil. There are a few that do, and if you're interested, I can send you a link to those. And so, of course, we've been killing soil life. So what do you think happens when that wonderful balance of eater and eaten is disrupted, when we dump a ton of nitrogen on there, for instance? We have to stop that. And if we want to cultivate plant life, we would do well to cultivate soil life first, feed the microbes, and then let them feed the plants. So what we need to do is, first of all, set up the right conditions. to select for the beneficial bacteria and fungi, microarthropods, nematodes, etc., etc. There are also non-beneficial ones, which we do not want. And again, this is something I've had to skip here. But so the right conditions for beneficials are aerobic conditions. And that means, of course, that we should stop compacting our soils. We should make sure that there is indeed 50% of it is indeed empty spaces where air and water can come through. And so that also means, by the way, no tilling. We have to stop tilling our soils, which really destroys this beautiful crumb. So a second thing we need to do is feed the microbes biostimulants. So this is different from what we call fertilizer. A fertilizer is something you feed the plant with. We have to stop doing that. We need to give these pro and prebiotics to the biota in the soil. And there's plenty of ways we can do that. And most of these ways we can actually create in our kitchen and in our gardens. So compost for soil. You can make a compost tea and you can put that on seeds. You can make soil drenches and foliar sprays. You can also make something called compost extract, which is you make a compost tea, and from that, and you manipulate it such that it only grows the type of bacteria and fungi that you want. That's called an extract. And then there are also actually anaerobic or fermenting remedies. And I mentioned Korean natural farming creates most of those. And again, I would love to give a talk on all of these things. And show some Korean natural farming inputs, how you make them in your kitchen as well. I make my own fish hydrolysate, for instance. It's called fish amino acids. And it's always fun to open that jar and have people smell it. It does not smell of fish. Can't do that here. So there's also, of course, a deeper lesson. And it's very simply this. If an explanation of basically anything is linear, you're missing an essential part. And any decision you make, of course, on the basis of that explanation has to be suspect. And an example of that, for instance, is glyphosate. A lot of glyphosate's very much in the news, of course, lately. So the way that works is this. So a large source of nitrogen for plants, especially in the spring, is something called glycine. It's a simple amino acid that the plant uses in building its tissue and the chlorophyll. The plant uses it much in the spring because, I mean, when you're looking out at the grass and you see that very bright green grass, that's due to the glycine. It's really ramping up photosynthesis to grow some more. So glycine in the soil is made by bacteria and fungi. And actually, glycine is used as proof of life in agricultural and horticultural soils. So in healthy soils, it's very abundant. Glyphosate is an artificial compound that mimics glycine. Plants take it up, but it's actually a dud, and it sits there and blocks something called the Shikimate pathway, and thereby starves the plant. So Roundup Ready crops, they are genetically engineered to not take up the glyphosate. So they can be sprayed with glyphosate or Roundup without dying, while all around them, the non-modified plants, they are fooled and they all desiccate, they die. And this makes for a very clean field. But of course, it also makes for a lot of glyphosate in our food and in our water and in our air. It is actually in all of our urine, it's in breast milk, it's in our blood. And people have been saying, especially the industry, that, well, that should be fine because humans don't have the Shikimate pathway. Human cells do not have it. But of course, it's true, we do not. But by now you should realize that the microorganisms, the gut microbiota, the bacteria and fungi in our gut do have those. And so glyphosate blocks their pathways, and it's not good for our gut biota. So this is very happening stuff. In 2019, there was a paper that came out about this, again, something I can share if you're interested. And since then, the controversy has been raging about this. But, you know, after this talk, it should kind of make sense. So I've left out so much and, you know, in 45 minutes, what can one do? I've made it really simple, but I hope you can see that in nature, everything is complex and circular and connected and looped. We can simplify, and in fact, we will always simplify, because we will never get to the bottom of this complex system that's actually always changing, right? And so it's okay to simplify, but we should always keep the circle in mind, the whole system. And I'm going to end with this beautiful picture. And I hope I can't see it. Let me change this. Chaos. I had written something underneath it. Human-made, human-made chaos. There's other kinds of chaos, of course, that do not look like this. So that is what I have. I'm going to stop sharing. As my very nerdy talk, and I'm thinking of more talks on, for instance, how to make compost tea, how to make fish emulsion, and all of that yourself. But I felt that this is really the foundation. It's like if you graduate from this kind of talk, then you're ready to understand what we're doing, fish amino acids, for instance, when we are feeding those in a foliar spray to our plants. And I would love to take questions and or hear any soil biologists here who have any feedback. It's always kind of unnerving to ask for those. And I hope that you can actually unmute yourself if you want to. Yeah, Debbie?
To unmute. I think I'm unmuted. I was wondering if you could just explain what the Korean natural farming is. I'd never heard of it before.
Yes, no one, it's quite on the fringe. So I was talking about, there are a lot of aerobic, that is air loving remedies out there for a soil that is degraded. And so compost teas too. When you make a compost tea, and I do make that in my shed, my own compost tea, it needs to constantly be aerated because the beneficials are, of course, bacteria and fungi that love air. So even compost teas, though they're liquid, are full of air. And actually even moving them from the shed to the garden in a car, you'd better have some sort of aeration going on in there with an air pump, etc. But there are these great ferments, though, and those are anaerobic, of course, solutions, like yeasts, made with yeasts, etc., that are also very good for your plants. And in Korea, they had these problems with overpopulation and farming that had to happen in urban areas. And pig farming is very popular there. And that, of course, created a terrible smell in the middle of the cities, all these little pig farms. So there's a group of people there who, using indigenous knowledge, said like, oh, we can solve this. And they came up with all these ferments that when you spray them on manure, when you feed them to the pigs, you know, it's of course a circular system. They take care of smells, they take care of the kind of rotting that you don't want. And some of those inputs, so I mentioned fish amino acids. They're all named by their acronyms, FAA. Fish amino acids is just basically putting fish leftovers. You go to the grocery store and you ask for their fish scraps, bones, skins, guts, all of it. You put them in a bucket. You add a lot of brown sugar. You put some apples on top, and then you let it sit for a year. And once in a while, you open the bucket to let it burp, because this is now fermenting, of course. And then after a year, you have this sludge, which smells very sweet. Actually, it does not smell of fish at all. You sieve that, and then the liquid that you get from that is the best fish hydrolysate that you can not buy, because it hasn't cost you anything. And then you apply that as a foliar spray. There's many other remedies. I could go on and on, but many of them are just made in the kitchen. A very simple one, for instance, is you just put milk in a jar on your countertop, and of course it will curdle. Usually when we make curdled milk, we use the stuff that floats on top for cottage cheese or something, and we throw away the liquid. Well, in this case, let's not throw away the liquid. That liquid is another Korean natural farming input that we can serve to the plant and the microbes in the soil around the plant as well. Even vinegar, brown rice vinegar, is one of those anaerobic remedies that are very nutritious to a garden. And I'd love to, when we are in person, do actually an in-person Korean natural farming talk where we can make this stuff together. It's kind of hard to do over a Zoom call. Anyone else have? Did I go too fast? Just I wait. Yeah,
well, I came in a little late, so I've been trying to capture a little bit of information on land and land management and the difference it makes, and particularly kind of the big picture of how it fits in the puzzle of solving for climate. And yeah, I just am so impressed with how little I understand here. I would need what you said again, and I would need you said, well, I'm leaving things out, and I'd like to hear all the things that you left out. And it would probably take me several repetitions, I think, before I got it.
Yeah. So this talk is actually, so I teach this talk for the permaculture, for a permaculture course for people who are taking that certification. And it's actually a 3-hour talk that I have now just put into 30 minutes. So you can imagine I left a lot of stuff out. And yes, there are a lot of bits to the explanation, and that is, and Harvey, what you just said is just exactly what was the point, is that it is so simple, really. I explained it in 30 minutes, and there's a lot of science that backs this up, and we've had this science for decades. This is really not something new here. And still in middle school, in college even, they teach it like that conventional picture that I shared. None of us really understand what's going on there. And like I said, we have made so many mistakes with our soils because of that basic misunderstanding. And for the climate, for sure, yes, carbon sequestration is a big topic, like I said. It does not just have to do with life in the soil, although I have to say that fungi play an enormous role in carbon sequestration in forests. Yeah, it's not something, if I start going there, it'll be just too much for this evening. But can I just see a show of hands of anyone else who's interested in that, and I could prepare a talk on carbon sequestration as well. Make it, again, really simple, but all right. So that's my next assignment. Ellen.
Yeah. So, it was super interesting, and I sort of am gravitating towards there's sort of the big picture and how this fits in, how we think about the world and the world as we want it to be. And then there's okay, now I'm out in my garden, actually doing stuff. So I'm just trying to think about what are 1 or 2 takeaways for me as I think about my own veggie garden, others, some of these things on what we might bring into the soil to avoid having to use fertilizer and stuff seem really hard and complex for me to do. Like I'm not going to make my own compost tea, probably. I'm not going to have an aeration pump or the fish thing sounds like, oh, maybe I could probably do that. So I'm just wondering at a practical level, are there one or two things that you think people can really do and then just sort of reconnect that to the cyclical explanation you gave? Like what are one or two things I might actually try to do, and how might what is that offsetting and what is that yielding me?
Yeah. Why should I do them? Yeah. Number one is stop tilling, stop shoveling, stop disturbing the soil. If you're growing potatoes, yes, you have to dig because they're in there and you got to get them out somehow. But any kind of crop that is above ground that you're growing, what I do is I snip it off and I leave the roots in the soil to die in there and feed the bacteria and fungi, and so that they can feed the next crop. Tilling also, like I said, disturbs this beautiful crumb that a healthy soil has. If you have a living soil, it will have that crumb because it is the microorganisms in there and the earthworms, etc., that make that porous soil. The moment you dig and you disturb it, step on it, even you just wreck that. You set up anaerobic conditions that then the beneficials will not come to. So that is number one. All farmers need to stop tilling. There's actually a great farm nearby, the Natick Organic Community Farm, whose barn just burnt down a couple of weeks ago. But they have stopped tilling and they are very knowledgeable about this. They also use Korean natural farming inputs, etc. I've learned a lot from them actually. And their crops are thriving. It takes a while to move from tilling to no tilling, but they actually persevered and they made it. And they grow a lot more food now, and that food is also a lot more nutritious. So that's number one. Also, never leave your soil unprotected. Never have bare soil. Healthy soil has a lot of life in it, but if it is that nice dark chocolate brown and it is bare, it is not protected from the baking sun, then in the top 2 or 3 inches, you will have no life at all. And that's really where it should be. So always cover your soil with some carbon, preferably something that will not decompose that fast. Even wood chips are fine, but I would use straw without seeds, seedless straw. Of course, you don't want to grow grass in that plot. Even a compost pile, even if your compost pile gets delivered to your house, or even the bags of compost get delivered to your house, or you have a compost pile that you made, obviously, cover it up. If it is not covered and the sun just bakes that, it will kill a lot of life in there that you have done your best cultivating. Anyone else can think? I could think of some more. Yeah, and stop using fertilizer from the store. I mean, making fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, by the industrial process is an extremely energy intense process. And then of course, for it to get to your doorstep, there's a lot of carbon emissions in the distribution of that, etc. as well. And then you add that and you just, if you have a okay soil, whatever is good in there, you've just wrecked that beautiful balanced system. So don't use industrial fertilizers at all. And don't use glyphosate. Don't use rec Roundup. Obviously, that is a no-brainer. Yeah, get good compost if you can find it. Debbie, yeah.
So when you say cover your compost, what are you meaning specifically? Are you talking about like kitchen waste kind of compost, or are you talking about yard refuse, sleeves, grass clippings kind of compost?
There are lots of kinds of compost, and boy, yes, we could get into that when we can be in person, for sure. Like I said, you know, some soils really, if a soil has been wrecked or disturbed, it may have a lot of bacteria, for instance, in it. It may be a very bacterial soil, but you need to bring fungi in as well, and that can get that whole process started. So you bring in a fungal compost, and a fungal compost is something that's made out of a lot of browns. It takes a long time to decompose, but a fungal compost is usually a very carbon-rich compost, while food scraps are very nitrogen-rich. And of course, you have to mix both of them, but someone who knows what they're doing could put a lot more food scraps and less of the carbon in there and create a very bacterial compost, which is what another soil might need. Usually what we do is we just dump it all and it does something. So in any case, whichever compost it is, you have to cover it. It's full of life, whether bacterial or fungal, or if it's a very mature compost, it can be full of earthworms. We need to protect it. So you just cover it with a tarp. A tarp will do, actually. But any soil too, in your garden beds, even in your garden paths, you will be covering those because you don't want weeds to grow. But I've seen a lot of garden with beautiful garden beds and then bare garden paths, and that's such a waste of space. You could grow a lot of worms. You can have worm bins in your garden paths. That's what they could be if you only covered them and kept them. I mean, you could walk on them, but don't dig them up all the time. Of course, if you leave it uncovered, you'll get a lot of weeds and you'll be doing a lot of digging there as well. The less we as humans disturb our gardens, the better, because nature knows how to do it, and let's just let it do its thing. Carl.
So Kat, I'm assuming that when you're talking about keeping paths covered, that you mean things like straw or wood chips or something.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. Or grass. You could grow grass in there too. It has its own problems. Either have it covered or have something living on it. And of course, the best covering of any soil is plant life. For instance, I had an old garden which I've had to walk away from. And what I did is, I mean, the soil there was, I had worked on that soil for a decade. And boy, I had arrived, as some people said. Namely, when I scooped up the soil, it had the right color. And actually on top of it was this it looked like cement, like little pieces of crumbled cement. They're actually all worm castings. Yeah. When you digged in these beds, this deep down, it was all worm castings on top. So, and it always grew a lot of great food. So when I walked away from it, I put it to bed. I did the right thing and I covered it, but I covered it with straw. And of course, there's no plants in there. And of course, like we know now, is that they too are a very important part of this nutrient cycling. So I actually did not do those beds a service. I should have covered it with cover crop. I learned that later on and did so later on, but I wasn't thinking straight either. These are lessons that are easily forgotten, strangely enough. Anyone else have? Yeah, Catherine.
I don't have much of a vegetable garden, but I know that people use winter cover crops, and then wouldn't those need to be tilled in or removed and disturb the soil? How does that fit into don't disturb the soil?
Yeah, so usually cover crops are dug in. There are levels of digging. You can put that big rototiller that you rent at Home Depot on it, and that I would not say is a good thing. You can also just with a fork dig it in. What I do with cover crops is I mow it, and then I just dig it in just a little bit, just in the top. And if your soil is really alive, that stuff will decompose really fast. And yes, because some of it is on the surface and the sun is on it, and of course it is blowing off, oxidizing a lot of its some of its nutrients. But if that soil underneath is really alive, they'll go for it. They will decompose it. They will take it up. Yes, it's never ideal. But cover crops, yes, be sure to end their life cycle before they set seed, unless you want another season of cover crops, of course. And that does mean oftentimes disturbing it to such a degree that it dies, obviously. Yeah.
I've been reading about mycorrhizal networks, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah.
Does that play in your, I'm just a home gardener with flowers. Is that at play underneath my soil?
I hope so. Yes. Mycorrhizal networks are, as the word says, they are the symbiotic relationship between the myco, the fungi. Mycology is the word for the science of fungi. And rhizal, like I said earlier, the rhizosphere is the word for root. So the plant roots and the fungi actually have a symbiotic relationship where, just like with the exudates, this could be a separate system actually from the exudate system, but where the plant feeds the fungi to then go out and grow and bring back nutrients, sometimes from very far away, relatively speaking. So I was talking about a rhizosphere and how the exudates go in there and the life in the soil then brings it these nutrients. If you also have a mycorrhizal network there, then that gut, that rhizosphere, the gut of the plant can extend much, much further. And that is basically that kind of relationship between fungi and plants has been going on for very long. It's super interesting stuff, boy. And this is really that we've known about, but as you dig deeper into that science, it is mind blowing. And there's some fantastic books that have come out by Peter McCoy. And these are clunkers this thick, but they read so well. And we don't know. It's amazing. We put people on the moon and we understand so much about, I don't know, black holes, etc., etc. But we don't understand nutrition. We don't understand how the soil works. We don't understand these symbiotic relationships. And this is really my interest in all of this. I mean, obviously, I do want to grow great tomatoes, but my other interest is in the culture that we have. Our Western culture is just not set up to think in a circular manner. We think of time, we think of space as all of it linear. All of our explanations of anything are linear explanations. And this understanding of how systems really work is very, very new. And that's because we have centuries of Western science and Western philosophy to fight, which have been dead wrong for all this time. And they are so ingrained in us now that we can't even see what is simply in front of us, right? That fascinates me, that blindness we have, why, and how can we see, right? How can we see again? And I have to also, I have to always be very careful to acknowledge all the indigenous knowledge that knows all of this stuff very well, maybe not scientifically with all these data, but I was sharing the picture of the pine needles. They understand how that all works, and we really need to start listening.
I want to say thank you, Cap, and not that I'm pushing you to end, but it's just very cool. So like it's super interesting. There's a interesting, I haven't read it. John's read it. It's called The Alchemy of Air. It's a story of how nitrogen fertilizer was first developed and how that all came to pass. A friend of our middle son's, who's a chemical engineer from college, has got a new company called Nitricity about developing fertilizer in a much more energy efficient way. You probably won't like because it's still fertilizer, but it's a step in the right direction, actually.
Yeah.
They're super interesting. But how this all came about and connections with World War II and stuff like that. So if you're looking for a science, interesting read in plain English, good, I'm told.
Yeah. I could share, I thought like this afternoon, like, should I put together a little bibliography? But I did not do that, but I will. I can see some people are interested. So this is actually maybe a good time to end, unless anyone else have more questions with a promise. Oh,
I
Carl,
had
did you?
one question. I'm thinking about a particular area in our backyard where before we moved into the house, the septic system was excavated, and when they put everything back, of course they didn't of course replace the soil the way it was.
Yeah.
We have maybe I don't know, maybe a foot or so of actual brown soil, and underneath that it's pretty much all sand.
Ah,
And when they dug this up, of course the sand came to the top, and as a result we have this very dry area that hardly anything will grow in.
yeah, yeah,
And so rather than being in a position of having to maintain and nurture living soil, we basically have to somehow rehabilitate dead soil. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to go about doing that. It seems like it might be a case in which the rule of not tilling might not apply. I mean, you might want to bring in organic matter and till and mix it more deeply.
yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that something that would be helpful, or?
Oh wait, yes. Yeah.
We might take this up with Kat offline. So if other people are interested in that particular.
Oh, well, I can say I will not be able to tell you right now what to do, but I will tell you that is exactly what Elaine Ingham does. Is she takes the most disturbed dead soils on the planet. She actually travels all over the planet and turns them into lush places. It takes time. It takes a lot of observation. And for instance, one of the things that I can do, although I do have a particular problem with it, is a lot of the life in the soil that you need to get this stuff going. You basically have dirt and you need to have first succession, second succession, and slowly you want to bring the life up and the plant life up as well. That's basically her process, by bringing in all these inputs in compost teas and composts, etc. You can pull it off, but you need to observe very carefully as you start changing that balance and make sure that you put the right kind of compost on that you need. That is easily done again at the kitchen table. So I have a $500 microscope here, which I got for one of my birthdays. And with that thing, it's just a 400 times magnification. I can actually see enough of the differences in the shapes of bacteria and fungi, etc., to tell which ones are beneficial and which ones aren't, and to count species. You just need a simple microscope to do that. And then on the basis of that, you do some counting, and Elaine Ingham has given some beautiful spreadsheets. So it takes someone a couple of hours of microscope work, looking at samples from your soil to ascertain what kind of life is there and what we can get started with. If there's none, it's easy. And then as you go through successions, you have to keep observing the soil, looking through the microscope, seeing like, oh, well, now we have a lot of bacteria, but very few fungi and no nematodes. Now we make an extract with nematodes in it and we apply that. You can imagine that's very intense, observation intense and input intense. But again, the inputs are easy to make. Well, easy to make. My own problem with the microscope is I get car sick. Because you're zooming through drops and drops and drops, and all these nematodes are zooming around, and amoebas are, and after an hour of that, I have to lie down. So that was unfortunate. But this is what Elaine Ingham does, and I talked about soil samples that you can send to labs, and we all know those. The lab results, it's all NPK, I mean, with a couple of extra bells and whistles. What you really need to know is what life is in that soil. You can actually take samples, send it off to Elaine Ingham's lab, and she can tell you. She has people doing the microscope work, and she can then tell you how to get going. It would be a very interesting experiment. I would love to be involved, actually. like I said, it would be an experiment. But this is done. She actually, Battery Park in New York.
Oh yeah.
It's apparently it is walked down so much. It's so compacted, such a compacted place, because it at certain of these festivals, not in COVID years, it has like 1 million people on it, picnicking, walking, dancing, jumping, that stuff. You can imagine that's very disturbing. Nevertheless, when you go there nowadays, even before COVID, is lush green grass and no fertilizer input. And that is because they brought in Elaine Ingham to keep the soil microbes in that grass happy. So yes, it's done. And we can take that offline, and maybe we can do something and invite all these folks in a couple of years to let's take pictures before and after. So this is a promise. It is fascinating, and I was kind of afraid it's way too nerdy, but again, it's just important that we learn these things, and there's a lot more to be said. And if you all don't mind, I will actually send a follow-up email with a link to this recording. I am recording, yes. And later on, when I have my act together, I would love to do the follow-up talk, maybe something practical about what you can do in your garden, how you can make these composts, what Korean natural farming inputs look like. That would be the way to go.